Community planning conversation today is with Len Heumann. Len is an emeritus professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the university and someone who has spent a great deal of his career focusing on the issues of housing, particularly affordable housing. Len, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon to talk about this
The
topic.
pleasure is entirely mine.
First, I want to just start off with a bit of controversy to get the conversation flowing along, and that is to ask, is reasonable housing a right or is it a privilege?
Boy, you really do cut to the quick. Well, to answer that question, and I probably will never give an answer to it, you got to back up quite a ways, and you have to look at one, what kind of society are we? What kind of economy are we? And I assume you're talking about answering this in the context of the United States of America, and not in some general, vague, philosophical way. I believe that housing should be a right. But what does the word right mean? And in a capitalistic society, one where we really try not to intervene into the marketplace and let the give and take of supply and demand generate everything, and especially housing. It's a huge, huge industry. It's a major engine of our economy. It's often looked at to see whether we're coming out of a recession or whether we're going into a recession, because it's such a expensive good, and it's such a long-lasting good that housing really, in many ways, is one of the engines of a capitalist society, of any society. And so that we're making certain kind of decisions in a society like ours for individual freedom and minimalization of government, and letting the free enterprise market decide what gets built and how the money gets spent. Even saying that, I think we should have a ground rule that we provide decent, safe, sanitary, and affordable housing for all people. Whether we do that with incentives and encouragements to work and to contribute to the construction of one's own housing if you can't outright buy it in the marketplace, and all the other kinds of ways we try to encourage people to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and function within society, I think we don't do anywhere near enough to provide opportunities for really affordable housing. I'm going to stop there because I know you're going to ask me more specific questions, and I'm going to come back to it through those more specific. In fact, the very next question on this list.
The very next question?
Yes.
Well, I've heard you talk about this many times with great eloquence, and one of the facts that you usually include in any conversation is what is the needed average salary to be able to afford what we usually describe as minimum housing, meaning housing that has a roof and four walls and will withstand a good wind and not 5,000 square feet of a mansion.
Right. Well, you can stop first and ask, what does it take to get out of poverty before even being able to buy a house? Once you're out of poverty, you should be able to rent a house of decent quality, because that's part of the definition of the ceiling on poverty. And today in the United States, on average, but certainly in Illinois, it's around $12 an hour. And what do we have as a minimum wage? 6 1/4, something like that. So about half of what is necessary. And what the viewer has to look at when you think of this is a person working 40 hours a week in a household, say, of 4 people, and they're working full time, and they're getting $6.25 an hour when they're going to need 12. And frankly, I think you need more than 12. You need 12 and benefits. You need
Okay.
particularly health benefits.
So that's even more than the definition of a living wage as
Y-
it is presently
You-
defined.
yes, without the two of those things, you can have both parents working in a household of four and not reach the amount of money that's necessary to really get by. Um, and as far as buying a home is concerned, these days, that's become even more and more difficult. People just at that kind of income, at $12 an hour and 4 mouths to feed, can't save. They just can't save. So they can't get the down payment they need. They're really living from hand to mouth. But at a quality level at that amount. But we're nowhere near that at the minimum wage. And there's so many people working at the minimum wage. So that's what we're up against. Probably, when you look at not having health care and the amount of people below poverty, and we're talking, 35 million people in the United States.
Who are having
Yeah.
problems
Yeah.
with appropriate housing. So as a community then, what are some of the steps that we can take to minimize this crisis?
Well,
I'm assuming from your definition or your description that
Okay.
you consider it a crisis.
yeah, and before I get dismissed and labeled as way out in left field, let me say that, first of all, I believe in a capitalistic mode of providing most of our goods in society and most of the housing in society. I have studied enough of socialized governments and have seen that they just don't produce and at anywhere near the quality and choice and location of goods like housing as a capitalist society does. And they only work really well when they're a very homogeneous society, where they're one culture and a small number of people and are not defending the world or any of that type of thing. Then you can be a Sweden, and you can provide for a number of people. But the more diversified a country, and the United States is an extremely diversified country in cultures and incomes and everything else, the more difficult it is to let government make these kinds of decisions. We're much better off with a private market system. That having been said, I think I also need to remind people that raising the minimum wage all the way from, say, $6.25 to $12 sounds absolutely impossible, that it would be inflationary, that no country can function at that level. And you have to remind people that as recently as late 1960s, say 1969, the minimum wage for one earner in a family of four took that family not only out of poverty, but about 25% above the poverty limit. So we have done this in the past, and we can do it again. As recently as 1980, and we were still only at about, we were below that level, but the minimum wage was paying at about 92% of the poverty level. So we were very close. And two people working easily get a family out. And even one maybe only working half-time could get a family out. But we have slipped and slipped and slipped since then, going from into the 80s, going into the 70s, into the 60s. I don't know for sure where we are right now, but I think it's probably around 58% of the poverty ceiling. People are really, really, really poor on the minimum wage, working full time. And they're not deadbeats. These are not people who are living off the dole. These are people who are trying to make it and trying to give back to society. It's just impossible. So the very first thing I would say is the easiest thing we could do is get the minimum wage, back up to a living wage, and provide health care benefits for everyone. That would go a long way. But I don't care what people want to go after to help with something like this. If you think education is the great equalizer, then let's really make our schools an opportunity to get ahead in society and not have this terrible division between high quality schools in the suburbs and just awful school systems in some of our center cities. It's just not an equal chance. The same education, the same degrees don't mean the same things in this society. If you want to work on that level, work on that level. It will help. It really will help. It really will give people an opportunity to get ahead. So there's lots we can do as communities, and it's odd that I don't talk about housing and putting more money into literally building affordable housing. For years here in Champaign, I was one of the founding members and currently vice president of Homestead Corporation. And Habitat for Humanity just had a weekend where they built 5 houses.
Why don't you tell people what Homestead Corporation is in case?
Homestead Corporation is a not-for-profit housing development and management corporation. We build housing and we stay on and manage it. We're getting more and more into building it and turning it over as sales to the home buyer, much like Habitat does. Where Habitat tends to build single family housing with the screened future homeowner providing a certain amount of hours of their labor as well as a lot of other free labor. Homestead Corporation finds subsidies from state, and federal, and local levels and donations of land from the cities and builds all kinds of housing, not just single family housing. We have an SRO, a single resident occupancy facility for 25 people here in Urbana. And we have tried to take some of the worst single-family housing in neighborhoods and rehabilitate it and improve that neighborhood and then rent it out. Mm-hmm. That has slowly been coming to an end because it's become impossible to do.
Impossible because it's a cost, or impossible because it's hard to get volunteers to work on these projects?
It's just impossible cost-wise. Mm-hmm. We have recently passed the lead paint laws that needed to be passed, but when you're dealing at the margins that a not-for-profit deals with and tries to buy very old housing and fix it up, fixing up and eliminating lead paint from a house just drives the cost right through the ceiling. We can't find houses anymore that don't have lead paint mm-hmm. in them, and it just stops us dead. We just can't do it anymore. So now we're doing some new construction for, again, working with the cities. We take infill lots that the city has, and we build new housing on it, and people can get that housing. There's a new house just a few blocks from where you and I live. We live a block apart. That is probably a $150,000 house that the new owner got for around $80,000. I mean, really a wonderful deal. And because we could build so many subsidies into it, because the land came free, because the contractor was a very good contractor and didn't charge an arm and a leg, and we were able to manage the whole process in such a way that the house became really very affordable, and the banks and everybody else helped.
And what does Homestead Corporation do to make certain that then that owner doesn't sell the house for $150,000 and make a $70,000 profit so it can be maintained in that affordable housing category that you're talking about?
First, the only thing we screen for is to make sure that they can afford the upkeep and maintenance of the house. And we do encourage them to take a course maybe at Parkland or elsewhere that helps them see what it means to manage a house and keep up the maintenance and what to be looking for each year and every 5 years and so on in making sure that the house stays up to code and beyond that, and where to invest in the house. Then all we do is take names that come from other government agencies, either from the cities or from the housing authority, and they do a certain amount of screening for people who are going to stay with the house. And we then try to pick a neighborhood and to integrate that house into a community where these people have always wanted to live, so that they're not going to try to resell and take the profit and run. They are extremely grateful to have their first home and the opportunity to be a homeowner, and to gain the equity that comes with being a homeowner rather than a renter. And these days, the last 10 years or so, that's been a powerful amount of money for a lot of people. So as far as I know, we have had no one that's done anything like that. And if and when that becomes a problem, maybe then we'll have some caveat where they have to say that they'll live in it for a certain length of time.
Well, let me lead you a little bit further on that to talk about there are mechanisms that can be put on the purchase of a house under the circumstances that you've just described, whereas a profit can be made, but it's a percentage thereof or X number of dollars, so that the cost of the house then doesn't leap out of the affordable category. If I understand correctly, I think this is what some of the community development corporations up in the Pilsen area in Chicago do to help maintain the integrity of their community up there.
Well, in Pilsen, it is an ethnic neighborhood. They work with a number of institutions in that community, and all the way down to block groups who work with the not-for-profit development corporations in making sure that the house or sometimes a walk-up flat or whatever it is really fits in with that community, and it becomes not something that just slips under the radar, but becomes something that's celebrated on that block or in that neighborhood. Then maybe neighbors coming in and doing the landscaping, with the owner, and it really becomes an asset of the community very quickly. We tend to do it much more so that the person kind of quickly disappears into the neighborhood, and nobody knows, that this was in any way subsidized. And we try to make sure that the house doesn't look that way, and we try to do it in a scattered site basis so that there is no symbol or mark that, here comes the government building subsidized housing. And yes, there are neighborhoods where the neighborhood is involved, and particularly these ethnic neighborhoods. Many more things come into play to make sure that the household is welcomed, becomes part of that community, and has assets to draw on and to bring to that community very quickly.
I don't want to let something slip by that you just mentioned, and I know it's something that you feel strongly about philosophically, and that is economically integrating neighborhoods, and you just sort of slid by with that, your description of what Homestead Corporation, one of their goals in the placement of houses. I'd like to get you to talk about that, and especially in relationship to then school integration and school diversity.
Okay. One of the things that happens once we begin to segregate, I'll start at the other end, and then I'll come back, is that segregation feeds on itself. And it doesn't matter whether it's a racial or ethnic or income or age or anything else segregation. People live separately from each other, and they then evolve culturally and other ways separately from each other. They don't have role models across the cultures, and they aren't as sensitive and and sympathetic and liberal-minded as they once could be, and they grow more and more prejudicial and more conservative, and they start to justify the differences between them and other people. And that starts to have effect on the cost of housing if someone else moves into the neighborhood. And you can have these tipping effects and these turnover effects. And they then begin to justify these economic expectations tend to justify why people live segregated and why people flee to the suburbs and further out to the suburbs and the exurbs and on to get this pristine, segregated community of like-minded people to myself and to hell with the rest of the world. In societies where housing has been mixed for a long time, you can take modern Greece for a Euro country, if you like, where the zoning and other things have made it possible and maybe even almost necessary for people living in mansions, living next door to people in slums and middle-class people and everybody else. This isn't even dreamt about, segregating ourselves as much as we have in this society, and in many ways continue to. And once you're an integrated society, there's no need to deal any busing. There's no need to worry about the quality of schools because, lo and behold, it's the richer people and the poorer people that are sharing the classroom together. And if you want quality education, then you're going to get it for your children. It doesn't matter who's sitting next to them in the classroom. And it happens, with the park districts. It happens with finding new jobs because you have neighbors who say, hey, I know what skill you have. Something just opened up that I've heard about. Rather than people who are unemployed on both sides of you. All of a sudden there's someone who can help you out. And word of mouth and the private market system can function at its absolute peak. It makes so much more sense to provide quality housing for everybody. I think it's a much more interesting community. The diversity is much more wonderful. You can celebrate all kinds of cultures, religions, and other kinds of backgrounds, and it just makes sense for governing the community, for governing our lives. So, that being said, we have done so much to make it very, very difficult to diversify our neighborhoods, both where we can infill and the new construction we're building. We tend to do this in a very segregated fashion. Now, on behalf of both planning departments for both Urbana and Champaign, I know that it's a high goal of those units and the way they have constructed their general plans for the community, that they would like to see more housing opportunities throughout the community, and certainly where all the new construction is going. But what we've been mainly capable of doing is mixing owner-occupied with renter-occupied housing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of your response and the fact that I watched the Champaign School Board, Unit 4 School Board meeting last night, and the big issues that they are under the pressures of meeting the court injunctions on having to balance their schools, both ethnically and economically.
Yeah.
And I reflect back on your argument that you just presented and how much easier it would be for us to have solved what we're going through in Champaign, and we wouldn't be busing students all over the community.
No.
And then in addition, we're facing a new issue, and that is we're creating bedroom communities in Muhammad and St. Joe, going along a bit about what you just described, and that is this is sort of the escape where people are going out there because I really or perceptually the schools are better, and this is where they're leapfrogging out of Champaign. I don't know if that's so much the case in Urbana. Since I live in Champaign, I know more about that school district, but that certainly seems to be presenting itself in some patterns that we're observing.
Well, if you realize, when I said there's 35 million people who are in really desperate need, we're a country of approaching 300 million people, so it's a little over 10%. And if we brought that down to Champaign-Urbana, it may be even a little bit less, maybe about 9%. If that 9%
We're
was,
scattered.
was distributed throughout the community, we would be dealing with everything as one community.
It'd be one in every 10 houses.
There wouldn't be any busing. There wouldn't be any, and the social pressure and the eyes of the community, in using Jane Jacobs' name here, not in vain, that, we would
Why
police.
don't you tell our viewing audience who Jane
We
Jacobs
were,
is?
just before we started, we were talking about several landmark deaths in the planning community, although she was never an urban planner. She was really an urban sociologist. But Jane Jacobs wrote a book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, back in the mid-'60s, that set city planning on its ear. The profession had lulled itself to sleep in its approach to the changing technological and suburban society that we had, and we were part of the problem. The kinds of zoning that we introduced, that helped separate people.
The highway system. The highway system.
The highway system. Yeah, it goes on and on. And her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, not only showed what has happened to American cities over its history up to that point, but she had chapter after chapter, or the end of chapter after chapter, where she suggested new ways of measuring what is a good city and ways to get there. Terms like measuring the social capital of a community was invented by her and has been people have been working on ever since. Anyway, we have lost someone like Jane, and one of the things she said was, you don't need as many police when you have a community that is naturally policing itself, where neighbors know each other, where they're helping each other, and if you're worried about someone having a drug addict child in a far-off neighborhood and not wanting to put them in the same school with your kids, if there was just that 1 in 10 houses where that problem could happen, and you could see it happen in the change of that child, and could help that family out, you would nip this in the bud. Chances are, and I know it sounds just wonderfully egalitarian and pie in the sky, but there are signs of this happening, and it can happen, and we need to if we don't want government to run the cities, we have to then take back control as citizens, putting in our time in the community, in volunteering and being our own best advocate and our own best planner and our own best social worker in those communities. We just have to do it.
So back to the building of affordable housing.
Which we really haven't talked about much.
Well, that's fine. I've led you off on some other interesting aspects. I'm primed with some questions since I just came back from Planners Network conference that was held up at the University of Illinois on the Chicago campus, and one of the sessions I attended was presented by Bethel New Life, which is a community development corporation up in the Chicago area, and they are doing some very interesting things. in relationship to low-cost housing, and my main focus on not just parallel things that you're doing here with the Homestead Corporation,
We don't compare to Bethel New Life.
but doing things in the way of green construction and energy efficiency
Right.
and some of these aspects. They've just built some new housing up
Yeah.
there where they're using solar roof shakes that they're integrating
All right.
into the
Well,
roofing
I
system.
better step back and give a real quick history of Bethel New Life. Patsy's picking some of the best examples in the whole wide world, literally here. Chicago has many, many not-for-profit neighborhood development corporations, but few can match Bethel New Life. Bethel New Life is on the west side of Chicago. It is in South Austin.
In Garfield Park,
Garfield Park area, right.
that helps people locate it a little bit better.
And it was an area after World War II that went through total racial transition. It had an all-white, I have to guess at what religion, Methodist, I think, community who literally just up and went further west out into the suburbs, except for their clergyman and his sister. The pastor of the largest church in the community said, we'll open a new church out there, but I'm keeping both churches open. I'm staying here, and you are going to raise money to help me and maintain this church in the original Garfield Park area. And that community did that, and they began working with that community. And they took a holistic view. Not only did they make sure housing was rehabbed and new infill housing was built and new elderly housing was built and the finest elderly housing, and they worked with other church denominations and so on. They also created jobs for people. They also worked with the schools. I mean, it was a truly holistic, like a little city hall in effect. Right at the heart of that neighborhood, and they created a lot of jobs, starting simply with recycling and getting into I don't know, all kinds of different. I know a number of these neighborhoods in St. Louis and other places, so I'm mixing up the various kinds of industries that they created. But at any rate,
they're probably very similar in some of the projects that they tried to accomplish too. Some of these different corporations.
Jeff Vanderloo up in St. Louis was a similar kind of
right.
operation. And, so this group has always been at the cutting edge. So when gasoline starts to get more expensive, or heating oil and so on, they're going to start looking at putting devices on roofs, solar panels to heat the water and so on, and using flat roofs of walk-up apartments to, if the structural will allow, to use rooftop gardening and all kinds, anything and everything. Vest pocket parks where you could have victory gardens for community, and they've just done. They're very, very imaginative and creative. I've had a number of my students go up and work there for a short period of time, in some cases a little bit longer, and then go off and form a new not-for-profit in various parts of the country. But housing is the core, and it remains the core in Bethel New Life's productivity. And throughout their history, when Habitat for Humanity came into existence, they not only brought them in to redo housing, but to do commercial areas very early in Habitat's life. And they brought in former President Carter. I think it's the first time he ever volunteered for a summer with Habitat for Humanity. I mean, this is a group that is very creative, very imaginative, and goes, and are willing to ask anybody for anything, and people do it because they know that they're going to get good results, and just beautifully managed, just kind and caring management, just I send every student I have who wants to become a houser
So
up there.
that's an interesting organization to look at as a model for some of these
Yes,
ideas, is
yes,
what you're
yeah.
you're
But in a
saying.
way now, they have such a history, and they're so polished and so sophisticated that it's daunting to try to use them to start up. When
But you could capture some ideas.
Oh,
from
absolutely, and you
way
get
they
inspired. Absolutely,
inspired.
yeah. Homestead it didn't look at them. Of course, we started with an SRO, which is also not the way a not-for-profit housing development starts, because that's really a tough type of facility to manage. It's a tough thing to locate in the community. People weren't happy when
People don't want
Homestead
that near
Apartments,
them.
yeah. But now it's a real asset to the community where it sits, and has never had any problems, and has helped housing values in that area as a result. But you don't usually start that way, and we had to go to Lakefront SRO, which is another not-for-profit up in Chicago, which just does this. They take apartment buildings and historic ones and revive them and fix them up and provide housing for people who are homeless, who are coming out of the homeless emergency shelters, and they thrive. Homestead here, in our SRO, I think within 2 years, 20 of the 25 people in our SRO were working full-time. And they had worked for years and years and years. But they got that home base, and they've got help with all the different community groups that were part of us developing that. Family Services of Champaign and Parkland College and everybody, helped out and got people their educations and got them the training and how to go look for a job and to get them back on their medication or whatever they needed.
And stable address
Yep.
and clothing
Yep.
to go for interviews and all the important things
Yep.
that.
And many of them will never go on to more fancy housing. Many of these people like the idea of just managing a single room with a small little kitchenette and a small little bathroom. And it's the best they've ever lived and the happiest they've ever lived. And, there's so many types of housing that we need. There's no one answer to this. In fact, diversity in housing is just as important as the diversity in our culture and our ages and our incomes and so on. We can't have public housing be one kind of stamp that looks like public housing.
That you can immediately
Yes,
identify it as what
immediately.
you're talking
Yeah.
about. That you can walk down the street and say, that's a Hope 6 project.
Right.
Actually, going back to what you talked about on Jane Jacobs, and obviously a book you would recommend people picking up and reading, it'll be in any library.
Absolutely. Multiple
Um,
copies.
Is that this SRO facility affords eyes on the street, quote and unquote.
Yep.
And this is what Jane Jacobs writes a whole lot about, is sitting on the stoop at night out on the street and watching the street, which gives this measure of safety because there are people out there watching what's happening and reporting what's happening.
Absolutely.
And that's all part of the big picture there.
Especially if neighbors, reach out to each other and get to know each other by name or at least by face and say hi every morning and so on. Then if something goes wrong, you'll tell them. You'll warn people, and you'll know this isn't right. That's not a person that should be going up to that front door. And what are they doing? Why are they staying up there so long and so on? So yes, it really makes an incredible difference. And then it becomes easier for the police to assign a foot patrol who is assigned to that neighborhood, who people get to know, and to work with the police for block parties and blocking off a given street, which I know we've done in our neighborhood, not for a long time though. We need to do it again.
I was actually thinking that our neighborhood, which was once considered one of the safest within the whole community, has now been racked with residential burglaries.
Yes.
And reflecting back on Jane Jacobs, more eyes on the street, which we don't have now where we live, would help with that situation.
I mean, part of the problem is two people working, leaving for work every morning
At the same
at the
time.
same time, coming back at the same time. Late afternoon, when there are a lot of kids walking from school and stuff, is the best time for young burglars to disappear into the neighborhood, and it's tough.
The check and balances
Yeah.
aren't there
Yeah.
as much.
If you had more retaillees, if you had, even if you had a few people who are out of work at the moment, they can serve a tremendous benefit to the neighborhood just by being the eyes and ears of.
Well, that brings back to another integration within diversity, which we haven't reflected on, and that is age and aging in place. And how do we construct housing or renovate housing so that as we are demographically getting older, people can stay in their original home, and that we will have neighborhoods that have a nice range of age. Then there's sort of the neighborhood grandparent for those younger children, not the natural grandparent, but a surrogate grandparent. So we see these mixes of ages, and
We realize now that there's so many simple things we can do to develop what we call a universal house. And by universal, we mean it serves throughout the ages for episodic disabilities and for chronic disabilities as we're getting older and so on. That means doing away with steps. It means doing away with thresholds that they can easily trip over. It's doing away with windows that are very difficult to open and close. It's providing the right kind of lighting under counter, as well as a ceiling light in the middle of the room. And
as our eyes get older.
Yes, as our eyes get older. They're just so, and it's not that expensive. And it doesn't have to be expensive at all. I mean, you can design housing from the most basic affordable housing to mansions that are absolutely beautiful and have no disabling effects in and of themselves. And if you do become disabled, they are barrier-free. And
barrier-free also means the width of the doorway. So
yes,
if you were in a
it does.
wheelchair, you could get through.
It's very hard to change that after the fact. It's not very expensive at all to do it in the beginning. I mean, making a hallway 6 inches wider and making a door 4 inches wider than they are
and
now.
a bathroom wider so you
Yeah,
can turn around in there.
And and the grab bars do not have to look industrial. You can make this very, very sensitive and beautiful design, and you can be very creative with it. But we don't think that way, and we've got to start thinking that way because we're aging rapidly as a society. And it isn't just the elderly. It's all levels of disabilities within our society that need houses that are easy to manage and functionally manageable, whether we have a physical disability or a mental disability or whatever. If we want people to live independently and to care for themselves at the margin of their ability for all their lifetime, which will save a tremendous amount of money in healthcare and social services and so on. You want housing that is absolutely barrier-free.
And it's good for the younger generation to not be separated from seeing
Yes.
what happens
Yes.
as people age. That happened very much after World War II when the highways came and suburbia came, and this separation occurred. And
Even in the suburbs, we tend to warehouse our elderly way where no one can see them, particularly the older suburbs. But there really is almost no need for nursing homes anymore. And the kind of nursing home that we could have is very different from most of the nursing homes that we do have. We can provide assisted living to people where they live as independently as they possibly can, given their age and limitations. And therefore, they are not only the most proud and happy and functional, but society saves a tremendous amount of money not having to care for people who could care for themselves, because we only have one form of aid when you're disabled or when you're elderly, and that is to put you under total care, whether you need it or not. one housing type fits all, and it's not true. And we need to understand that, and we need to have that diversity in everything we do, in every service we give, in every education we provide, and every housing type we provide.
I'd like to acknowledge another good use of your expertise, and that is your years of service on the Champaign Planning Commission. Briefly explain why communities have planning commissions and what is a major role of a planning commission. I know it varies community to community,
It does.
but just a general ideas so our viewing audience appreciates
Okay.
the volunteers who do this kind of work.
Very often, the planning commission in any city is the, I guess, most powerful lay appointed commission or committee in the city, and it's because it oversees a tremendous amount of development that goes on, of new construction, of infill construction, commercial, industrial, and housing, and frankly, they become an terribly important check and balance. The pressures in a capitalist system are tremendously high on the council and the staff in working with developers, and there are examples, thank goodness, in neither of our city here that I know of, where there is payoffs, there's under the table dealings with developers and special favors that are done in both directions. Cities like where I go and be a snowbird, San Diego has kicked out 2 mayors in a row and most of the city council, and it's awful, and a congressman for doing these kinds of things. But if we think lobbying is a big deal in Washington, where it's the biggest deal at the local level is in new development and getting the clearance of property if we have to clear property for some new type of development. And a lay board or a commission that oversees and is just staring at, this is the plan, here's what you're proposing to do, and you want certain kind of variances or certain kinds of exceptions to the plan, and why are you doing this? And the staff in both cities does a wonderful job in making sure that they're not giving away the store, I think, and in helping the community and creating new jobs and new opportunities of various kinds. But it's important because they're working on a day-to-day basis. The developers are coming in, the contractors are coming in, they're talking to them. To have some lay group to oversee this and say, is this good for the community? Is this where the growth should be heading? Does it provide the kind of amenities that are going to serve the surrounding neighborhoods? Does it blend in well? Does it really become an asset to the community? Or is this going to become something we're going to have to bail out in years to come, this kind of neighborhood? Or is this going to create conflicts in land uses that are going to make it miserable for everybody involved? And that is obviously very, very complex and very difficult. And that leads to probably the next question is, do we have really good lay commissions that can do this? I'm going to give one other, and this is somewhat going to sound cynical at first, but let me put it completely out there. And that is, the elected officials, I think, can use a plan commission to help ease some of the more difficult issues that come up. Because whenever we plan, somebody's going to benefit, but somebody usually, a cost comes down on somebody, some neighborhood, some external effect from putting something new in next door. You don't have the vista you had before. You don't have the quiet you had before. You don't have the amount of traffic coming by you had before. Whatever it is, there's going to be adjustments, there's going to be a price to pay, and there's going to be people who profit from these things. And by these problems coming to the Plan Commission first, I think in many ways the City Council can say, whoa, here's one that's coming down the pike where it's going to fill the council chambers with people, because it certainly has for the Plan Commission. Or they can say, they can watch it and they can say, the Plan Commission did an excellent job of hearing the public out in this and talking this out. And they've made a recommendation, which, helps, because they're part of that public as well, to us, that helps strengthen our position and the right position, and in how we should be deciding. So it's another layer, but it's not an elected layer, so that the council still owns the problem. They have the final say on it. They're the only ones that are truly voting. The Plan Commission only makes a recommendation to the council. But they are an important layer, I think, in community airing its worries and its needs and its problems. And for the most part, we do a fairly decent job, I think.
Well, we thank you very much for your years on the Planning Commission. And we thank Len for his reading suggestion, Jane Jacobs' book,
The Death and Life of Great American Cities.
Thank you again for watching Community Planning Conversations. And remember, planning matters.